Hey guys, Jim with Trevor here. Welcome back to part 2 of essentially the how to squat tutorial. Today in part 1 we went over the actual setup of how to get yourself into position, where to place that bar and how to set up for the actual squat itself. And today in part 2 we're going to be going over the eccentric and concentric phase of the squat. So essentially we're going over how to perform that in the most efficient and effective way possible. So with all movements, it's important to remember that when you're in your starting position, point A, and into the position that I'm going to refer to as point B in the hole, and then point C as the final position, it's very important to remember that we always want to travel in the most efficient, with the most efficient bar path possible. So what that's going to look like, it's going to look like a completely vertical line from point A into point B, and then from point B back up to point C. So today we're just going to go over how to ensure that your bar path for the squat is maintained in that vertical line, and then we're just going to be going over how to remain stable and efficient throughout. So I'm going to skip ahead into me being in that starting position. So I'm going to assume you guys have watched the how to actually set up for the squat video. So I'm just going to not talk through this. But so now I've set myself up into that starting position. Now after I take my brace, after I take my brace, what I like to do before I even take my brace, this is something that I recommend for you guys, or even to just try your warm up, is to rock back and forth. Rock back and forth because it's very important for you to find the midfoot of your body. The midfoot of your body, like this is a very common thing, like I say again and again, the midfoot of your body is going to be the most efficient area for that bar path to travel up and down through. So as I rock back and forth, you'll be able to find or feel the point of tension where your feet essentially is rooted into the floor. How I like to find that point is by applying a bit of pressure into that big toe, applying a bit of counter pressure on the outside of your heel. And so when you do that simultaneously, you're going to feel your midfoot pop up. You're going to feel the midfoot actually not really contract, but you're going to feel extra tension there. And that's going to be a point of your midfoot where you want to apply pressure through. So as we're lowering our body through that eccentric, you're going to be applying pressure through that midfoot. We're going to imagine that a line's going through that midfoot, the stay of that point. So now as we perform our initial break, it's important to remember that the initial break is going to vary depending on lifter by lifter. But in general, I'm going to rubbish a myth where you say, yes, the low bar is a very hip dominant movement, but even with that initial break, there's going to be an element of knee travel, of initial knee break. So if you want to learn more about that, I've already done a separate video on that. I'll link it down below. But essentially, with that initial break, you want to break at the knees and the hips simultaneously. So you're not going to be doing a good morning squat where you're breaking with the hips, because that's going to shift all your force backwards. And you're not going to break it solely at the knees, because that's more for a high bar squat, and then you're going to compromise the ability of your torso to get into a good position. So with that initial break, you're going to be performing that with your hips and your knees simultaneously. So you guys might see Ray Williams squat. With his squat, it's very obvious with his initial break because he does it in a very jerky motion. You'll see with his initial break, it really emphasizes that hip-knee simultaneous break like that. So after you've taken your brace, after you perform that initial break, as I travel down through that eccentric, it's important to let both the knees and the hips travel, because if you cut off one range, you're going to compromise the stability and you're going to compromise your movement pattern. Now, after I perform that initial break, as I load down, I'm going to keep loading force through my midfoot. So I'm going to keep loading force into my midfoot. This may change for lifters. What I mean by that is the area of your midfoot, because during day-to-day life, that's not an area, or that's not a point where we constantly use. So it may be a bit foreign. So when I just to go back and when I talk about that rocking back and forth, that fourth cue or exercise even, I like to in my warm-ups, I'll do like a bar set where I simply, as I'm lowering myself down with the bar, I rock back and forth, just so I can really feel and emphasize that midpoint, and for that to carry over to my sets or to my top sets and my back offs. During those heavier sets, I wouldn't actively do that because it's very dangerous. You're compromising the stability of your body. But even with a bodyweight movement, or just with simply the bar, as I like to do like an empty bar set where I actually do rock back and forth, just so I can feel that midfoot of my bar and to really drill that in. So that's all I'm going to waffle on about in regards to the midfoot of your body. But so let's get back into that position where, as I'm lowering myself down, the next thing that I want to talk about is essentially opening your taint. Now, what I mean by that is, if you imagine like I'm just under my rear area, there's that space there, and I want to create space there. Now, why I like to use that cue is, you see a lot of lifters, they advocate to spread the floor, or to shoot the knees out, to root your feet into the floor and spread that floor. Now, the problem with that cue is it forces too much external rotation in a body part, in your hip joint, in an area that's not designed to have that much external rotation, because with that hip joint, it doesn't normally move like that. So the cue I like to use, where you actively open your taint, as I lower myself down and I think to open my taint, that will force my knees into the optimal position, whilst ensuring that my hip joint is in a very effective spot. So I'm opening my taint to see into the hole. I'll do that again for you guys. So to go over the recap of the eccentric phase, after you take that brace, you're going to break at the knees and the hips simultaneously. You're going to load force through that midfoot, and you're going to open your taint as you sink into the hole. So it'll look a bit like this. Now, as you come out of the hole, now we're going to move on to the concentric phase. Essentially, with the concentric phase, you're doing the exact same thing, but in reverse. So as you load force into the ground to bring yourself up, yes, it is a leg press. You're pushing the floor away from you. That is a good cue to use, but it's very important to remember to keep loading that force directly vertically down and through the midfoot of your body, to ensure that that bar remains over the midfoot and center of your body, to being the most efficient form from point B to point C. So that's the first thing to remember. Load force through your midfoot. Now, the second thing to remember is we want to maintain a flat torso throughout the lift. So when you're coming out of the hole, you don't want to be shooting that chest up, or you don't want to be shooting the hips up, because that throws your torso angle out of the standard flat back norm. Now, if you think about it, so say this is the position which I lower myself into. As I come out of the hole, I want to maintain this flat angle of my back. So I don't want the chest to shoot up, I don't want my hips to shoot up. So as I push down out of the floor, to get back to my starting position of point A, I want to do a reverse. Now, because the low bar squat is a very hip dominant movement, and for us to get down into our bottom position, there was a bit of hip travel backwards. So as I come out of the hole in reverse, I'm going to essentially drive my hips through. I'm not going to raise my chest. I'm going to perform a hip thrust. I'm going to drive the hips through for me to get back to my starting position and my lockout. So it'll look a bit like this. So right now I'm at point B, the bottom position. As I push myself out of the hole, I'm going to drive through that midfoot, and from this point, for my lockout, I'm going to drive my hips through to perform that lockout. I'll do that in fast time for you guys. Beautiful. So the two key things for that concentric phase of the squat is to remember to apply pressure through that midfoot, and to essentially when at that lockout, when you're completing the lift, to reverse the movement you did getting into the hole, and to drive the hips through instead of arching the chest up, or to untuck the hips, you know. So that's just to recap what we went through today. During that eccentric phase where you're loading into the floor, the couple key things to remember is you want to find the sweet spot. You want to find the midfoot. You want to find midfoot tension just by pressing down on your big toe. So pressing down big toe, and you're pressing down your outer heel. And you'll find that when you do that, your midfoot, the midpoint of your foot actually pops up a bit, and you'll be able to really feel how to find that sweet spot. So you want to lower yourself in accordance to loading into that midpoint of the foot, and you also want to try the cue of opening the taint to push yourself into the best position. Now, in reverse, during the concentric phase, you want to do the exact same, but in reverse. You want to load tension into the ground through that midfoot, essentially leg pressing the floor away, and then for that lockout, you want to drive the hips through. You don't want to do any other movement that compromises the stability or the angle of your back. You want to maintain that torso angle, and essentially you just want to drive the hips through, because it's somewhat of a complex topic if you don't understand the theory behind it, but once you get out, it's quite a basic topic, because essentially with that squat is, say this is your torso angle. We want this angle to be maintained throughout the entirety of the movement. So as I come down into the hole and I've maintained this flat angle position, So say this is my initial upright position. As I come down to the hole, there will be an element of natural torso lean. So my hips have gone back in relativity to my torso. But what's most important is to remember that at the whole point, my torso angle is maintained flat. Now, because my hips have moved away from that starting position, when we come out of the hole in reverse, we want to reverse it by driving the hips through. We want to bring the hips back to that starting position, and that will flatten out our torso, and that will ensure that we get back to that point A position. So that's all from part 2 today about the squat, where we go into a bit of the basics of how to actually perform the movement itself, giving you guys a few tips and cues to try to see if that helps. But that's all from me today. I hope that was helpful for you guys, and I'll catch you guys next time. Take care.